All right, so how things went wrong. Humanity's sin has bent and broken the goodness of everything God created, and we see the results of that bending and breaking everywhere. All of us experience broken sexuality in some way, and we want to encourage kids to share when they figure out or when they discover where broken sexuality is part of their story. I think it would be helpful to kind of tease out what I mean by sin and brokenness. So sin is a willful disobeying of God's law, right? So if I lied to you, I've sinned. We can sin unknowingly, but it's still a disobeying. It's a rebellion against God's law, breaking of God's law. Okay, but what do I mean when I say brokenness? Well, this is what happened when sin entered the world through Adam and Eve. Their sin caused a chain reaction that bent or broke every perfect design and order. The Jesus Storybook Bible says, God's creation started to unravel and come undone and go wrong. Right? I think that's a beautiful description of the brokenness of the world. God first perfectly designed and ordered the world, and then humans sinned and then kept sinning. And that sin caused a chain reaction that bent and broke God's design and order. Nothing, Romans 8 tells us, was left unaffected by that brokenness. And the world continues to be a broken place, and we continue to experience the effects of that brokenness because humanity continues to sin. Now, that does not mean that God's good is overcome by that brokenness. It's not. There's still a whole lot of good in the world. And the world is still a good place in that sense because we have a good and perfect creator. And the world still reflects the design and order and God's goodness in many ways, but it's not perfect the way he first created it. Nothing is untouched by the brokenness that sin caused. And I think that's where we have first conversations about sexuality with our kids. We have brokenness conversations first and then sin conversations later, because with our younger kids, the challenges that they're first going to face are the brokenness in themselves or others, or the sin of others, or just the general brokenness of the world. Too often we want to wait until our kids are old enough to start sinning sexually themselves, to start making kind of like conscious sexual sin decisions, but by then it's too late because they've already been exposed to a lot of brokenness and a lot of sin of other people, and we need to talk to them about those things, right? Okay. So I said that no one has unbroken sexuality. None of us know what it's like to experience sexuality in the way that God first intended. Our need and capacity for connection and community has been broken to the degree that the way we experience intimacy, family, singleness, and marriage are pretty marred and dim versions of the way God wanted them to be when he created the world. We can see sexual brokenness in places like infertility, widowing, intersex conditions, gender incongruence, same-sex attraction, culture's idolatry of romance. We can go on, right? Kids can be sinned against. They can be sexually abused, be exposed to pornography, sexual jokes and slurs at school, right? And the sins of others can affect our kids. Parents' divorce, parents' addiction to pornography, parents who have an affair, gender expectations that are extra-biblical, and again, we can add to that list, right? And at creation, God did not intend for our kids to experience any of those things. They are brokennesses, and some of them are sins that other people commit, either against our kids directly or indirectly. And added to that, we are not able to do connection and community well. Jealousy, selfishness, pride, bitterness, laziness, conceit, lust. These all mess up the way that we are supposed to be in community with one another, the way that relationships and family and marriages are intended to work. We're all just broken people trying to be in relationship with other broken people. We will mess up, we will sin. We can't do this well without the Spirit's help, right? So, things have gone wrong, and we want to encourage kids to share when they discover those brokennesses, either in themselves, in others, or ways they've been sinned against. Here's a way you could do it. Yeah, man, these kinds of things are hard and they're scary to tell, but I hope that you'll tell me the hard things as they happen in your life. I will listen to you and comfort you You cannot get into trouble for telling me hard things. And I will be so happy that you've told me so that I can help. We will figure it out together, and I will do whatever I can to help you thrive in God's good plan for your life, right? Kids think they're going to get in trouble if they tell us they accidentally saw pornography. Kids think they're going to get in trouble. We're going to kick them out of our family if they tell us that they're gay. Kids think that they're going to hate us if they tell us, that someone touched them inappropriately, or even if they had sex that they wanted to, right? Remind your kids, hey, you don't get in trouble for telling me hard things in your life, because I am here to help you as you work through those, and I want to work through them with you. All right. So part 2, things went wrong. Part 3 is the good news. There's hope. We are still able to find beauty and goodness, and we are still able to flourish even in this broken world, because God offers us his wisdom through the Bible and through the church. And when we follow God's wisdom, we'll find the greatest joy, the deepest meaning, and the richest belonging in this life. So remember, experiencing brokenness, broken sexuality, is not your child's fault. So when a child shares, reassure them, I know this is not your fault. Again, this is not the same as sexual sin, right? This is brokenness. This is not your fault. This is the result of the fall, sin nature, living in a broken world that wounds us repeatedly. Remind them that God is also not surprised, and God is also not disappointed in them, right? God knows our kids experience broken sexuality. He's not surprised. And remind them that God's designs and plans for sexual stewardship still apply, regardless of the kind or depth or, experience of their brokenness. God's wisdom is still good, and God and you, as the parent or the Christian community, still hope that they will follow God's wisdom. Plus, God is always at work, and he seeks to redeem all brokenness for our good and his glory. And we're still able to find goodness and beauty in the world because it is a world that God created, and sin can't overcome that completely. We're burdened with brokennesses we don't choose, but we're still able to flourish. And God shows us how through his word and through the church. Okay, so that's God's better story. God has good wisdom for everyone's sexual stewardship. He made us for intimacy in the context of family. We find that intimacy through one of the vocations, relational vocations that God has given us. Sin bent and broke God's good plans. We all experience sexual brokenness, but there's still hope. God's plan for sexual stewardship is still good and leads us to the most joy, satisfaction, and belonging in this lifetime, if or when we follow it. Okay, we spent a long time on that. Why do we do that? Because that's the foundation for everything you're going to teach your kids about sex, sexuality, and gender. Okay, those 3 parts. That's the foundation. Yeah.
I'm going to put Ellie on the spot, if that's okay.
Oh.
You had a really good question about going back to the chart and just kind of, but you were talking about the table. That was really good.
Is this a singleness question?
Yes.
Okay.
You want me to hold it?
Yeah, can you hold it just for a second? We're almost to the turn and talk, and then that'll be a great place to stop. Yeah. Okay, because that's the foundation that our kids need for discussing other things like gay marriage. It doesn't make sense to talk about gay marriage before they know what Christian marriage is, right? It's the foundation for talking about things like teen pregnancy. Like, teen pregnancy doesn't really have much bearing on their lives until they learn what sex is meant to be for and where it's supposed to be. Anything else you can, abortion or transgender issues or pornography or, why do we not call someone a sexual slur? All of those things have their foundation here. And so that's where we need to start, is building that foundation. And then we're going to add in those other conversations, always going back to the foundation that we build about God's, plan, God's better story. So yes, cultural questions are important, but this is what's going to help us answer those cultural questions. Okay, what's your question or your comment?
Oh, yes. I was just sharing with them from that I have a bit of a difficult time with the diagram.
Uh-huh.
And I remember, the first sexual stewardship conference we had was the first time I had kind of been introduced to this idea of vocational singleness,
Yeah.
which I think is a beautiful thing. But I struggle with the kind of like two options, right? And I was just kind of sharing with them, like, right now for me, it feels like I'm stuck in a neutral position. And I don't right now feel like God is saying yes to either path.
Sure.
For sure. And I think that's just tough, and that's just what I was sharing with them.
Yeah.
Is that's just kind of difficult to like a spot to be in, because I think there can be a temptation to think like I can't be as useful for the kingdom if I don't feel confident which way God has called me.
Yeah.
And I think there's definitely an area in which that's true, right? Kind of like you said,
Sure.
like, if I'm not being obedient to what God has said because I'm like, well, I'm holding out
Right.
and I can't
Right.
do this because God might send,
Right.
my husband while I'm doing,
Yeah.
But I guess we were just kind of talking and curious if you could just speak a little bit more into that, because I think it's hard to be in that neutral spot and to be like, there's not a certain age where you
And there's not. Yeah.
And I was just telling them that you can kind of almost feel behind, right? Like, I'm stuck here and everybody else is just
100%.
and
Yeah.
I don't know that there's a good answer per se.
Yeah.
It's just,
Yeah.
It's something that I think I'm going to have to wrestle with
Yeah.
a little bit more, which is totally fine.
Yeah, I think two things come to mind immediately. One is that you probably didn't grow up hearing about, I think you said that, you didn't grow up hearing about discernment. So this is still new.
Yeah.
And you don't have to answer me. My question is general. Are you discerning? And are you, I think there's a discerning in which we're like, hey, God, like, and I'm not saying you're doing this. I think a lot of us do this with a lot of things. But it's like, hey, God, like, should I get married? And then a month later we might be like, hey God, should I just stay single? I seem to be single. Like maybe I should, it's not really, the discernment process that I'm talking about is not one that I was ever taught. I had to read about it in a book. And it's called, it's an Ignatian way of discernment. We don't talk about, that's, what?
Did you read about the Jesuit Guide to Almost Everything?
No, it's a whole book. It's called, no. It'll come to me. Anyway. It is a Jesuit thing. Man, though, like I'm not Jesuit, but like that book is good. like it really, the process is not, we just pray about it a little bit. It's a whole, like we write down pros and cons and we think about like, what would the future look like if I went down this path? And what would the future look like if I went down this path? And we talk to our mentors and we talk to our therapists and we ask friends to pray with us. And it might take 2 to 5 years. Like my friend who committed to singleness, he discerned like that, like serious discernment for 6 years before he committed to singleness. He wanted to be sure, right? And he was not somebody that was like, I just want to stay single. He was like, I think I could do marriage equally well. And I really don't know what God would have me. Now, he had some inklings in college, but he wasn't sure. So he didn't commit then. He spent 6 years discerning. So I don't think you're weird for just learning about this. Let's say you're 25. For learning about this at 25 and at 26, you're like, I still don't know. I don't think that now. Frustrating, sure, but not weird, not like you're doing anything wrong. So I think that's part of the problem in the sense that the wider Protestant evangelical, we get a little weird when we start talking about the Holy Spirit, and like relying on the Holy Spirit to like teach us and to listen to God. It's just, I wasn't taught to think of prayer in that way. It is a very practical, it was sort of like, hey God, like I'd love for you to do this. If you don't, it's cool because I know it's all in your will. But this is a very practical way of thinking about like the future and the big decisions or even the small decisions of life. So that, and then also give yourself grace. Yes, I wish God would give all of us answers when we're 18 and then we'd know which one to pursue and like we didn't have to do the discernment thing. I don't think you're doing anything wrong by not feeling like I don't know yet. Could be one of those people that never know. That sounds really discouraging, but encouraging in the sense that you're not doing anything wrong. And I hope that Antioch, the community, is supporting you in that, encouraging you to discern, encouraging you, praying with you and for you, and pointing out areas in your life like, hey, like, have you ever thought about this, this, and this? That could be, pointing you towards this direction. Have you? And then you can go pray about it. So yeah, it's a lot of very practical ways of looking at our life and our circumstances and perhaps the job or the ministry work that God has called us to, and some of those can help point us to a direction as far as relational vocation. All right. Are y'all cool if we skip this so we can stay on time? All right. We'll skip this one, but yeah, again, those three parts of that better story are the foundation for a lot, most, 99% of the conversation you'll have with kids. Okay, we're doing great. All right, so why follow God's wisdom? We've heard about God's wisdom for relational vocations, how to discern, how to best live out those vocations. But I think a lot of teens, maybe some adults, are like, man, living my life according to that wisdom is inconvenient, maybe costly for me. Why should I follow God's wisdom? And I think that's a fair question, because if you look around at kind of, again, cultural Christianity that's not really following God's wisdom, particularly when it comes to relationships, they're not stewarding their sexualities according to God's wisdom. We can look at the divorce rates, and we can look at the pornography usage rates, and we can see that. But I want to submit to you 3 reasons that it is worth it to follow God's wisdom and teach it to our kids. 1, because God's wisdom will lead us and our children away from idolizing romance and assuming that they'll get married because that's their or their caregiver's preference. Remember, cultural Christianity teaches kids, God gave me a desire to marry because he wants me to get married. The purpose of marriage is companionship and mutual fulfillment. I only have to have kids if and when I want them. God calls a few select people to singleness, but they don't have sexual desires, and they have this super spiritual gift of not needing family. God sustains them. That's all they need. The church is not responsible for caring for them. And then friendship can't provide the same level of companionship, family, and intimacy that marriage can. And friendships should not be too close. Again, those are cultural Christianity's views. But what are the results of those beliefs, particularly for kids? 1, teens and young adults are not refraining from romantic and physically intimate relationships before they get married. Our kids assume that they will get married, and they assume that marriage will satisfy every intimacy need that they have. They assume that marriage is about making them happy, and they assume that being in love is enough to sustain their marriages, and when it's not, divorce is the logical step. Now, why do they believe that? Well, it's because the married people around them are not honoring their through thick and thin vows, and they don't see raising children as one of God's central purposes for establishing marriage. Straight Christians aren't upholding the sanctity of marriage. Many marriages fail because those in them accept inaccurate expectations about what marriage is and will be. We don't see marriage as lifelong and difficult. We don't think we need provision from the Spirit. And then few will accept or even consider vocational singleness as a calling. Again, it's relegated as a curse of loneliness for the sake of the gospel. We don't learn to do friendships well, and as a result, we live very disconnected, isolated lives. We fear close friendships, and we don't do life as true family in the body of Christ. But here's the thing, marriage is not supposed to be, it never was meant to be, the normative relational model for the Christian individual or the Christian community. Marriage is one option for followers of Jesus. Celibate singleness is an equally legitimate option. The authors of the New Testament consistently remind us that the genital expression of our sexuality is not a requirement to living a full and complete life. And so we want to teach our kids God's wisdom so that we help lead them away from idolizing romance and assuming marriage. And then 2, God's wisdom will lead caregivers, that's us, away from focusing only on sex and marriage when we talk to kids about sexual stewardship. We talked about this a little bit. Why do we do that? Well, again, because the starting assumption is that sexual expression in the form of romantic love is an experience that every human deserves. It's the ultimate good. And because for Christians, marriage is the only place that genital sexual expression is allowed, we urge our kids to recognize that sex is worth the wait. Because if true Christian love waits on sex, the truth of one's love is best measured in terms of sexual activity, or lack thereof. So what do we use to promote those ideas? Purity culture. Okay, I grew up in purity culture, had the ring, did the pledge, all the things. Okay, so I was definitely a part of that. Now, there have been a lot of people hurt deeply by purity culture. And hopefully we've learned a lesson from that, but I think we are still teaching it in some covert ways. We may not do the rings, but it's still in our language and it's still in the ways that we teach kids, right? But the problem is that the kind of intensely promoting abstinence is really reinforcing selfish desires for gratification that set up kids for disillusionment and dissatisfaction in marriage. And oftentimes, unfortunately, kind of helping or teaching kids to remain totally pure requires adding to Scripture. There's a whole set of rules that you got to follow to make sure that you don't look or nobody looks at you in a way that inspires sexual thoughts, right? And I think purity culture and abstinence programs, although well intended, I think they miss the point of our bodies. Scripture says, 1 Corinthians 6 says, the body is for the Lord. It's not for another person. It's for the Lord. And I think also those programs devalue singleness. So there's a lot to be kind of careful about, right? We don't want to use sex to sell abstinence. Great sex is not a reward for remaining abstinent in singleness, although it's sometimes set up that way. That's not actually true. In fact, I would argue that that is a sexual prosperity gospel. We've connected faith and obedience in singleness to good marriage and great sex. It's a promised blessing if you follow the rules. That's a prosperity gospel, right? But what happens when a faithful and obedient single gets married and experiences sexual difficulties or hardship in marriage? What happens when a faithful and obedient single doesn't find a spouse and never gets married? What happens to their faith in the God who promised them those things? After all, they followed the rules. Where's the blessing? People's faith has fallen apart.
Can I
So,
say something?
yeah.
So I think in general, like in my, just from what I can remember from the purity things that I was part of, like there was a pointing towards, ultimately you are God's and you don't want to serve your flesh and give into the temptation.
Mm-hmm.
But like link arms and agreeing we will, whether it's a ring or not, I didn't wear a ring, but like we're committing to something bigger than these temptations because of this scripture.
Yeah.
So I think there is a place for that.
I think there is a way to do it well.
Yeah.
I don't think there's a way to do it really poorly. Just as with a lot of things we teach our kids about God's wisdom, right? There's a way to do it well. There's also a way to do it poorly.
Also in that sense, so like not to argue, but
No, yeah.
there's a lot of proverbs that are in general, if you do this, then it will go well for you or whatever.
Yeah.
Obviously that's not always the case. There's always
Yeah. Is that a general wisdom or is that a direct promise to each person who does that? I think it is. I would agree. And this is what I want you to teach your kids, right? That God's wisdom, when we follow it, we're going to have a better outcome, a better life than we would if we just didn't follow it. I think, though, there's a difference between, let's say that your kid wants to play pro ball, and you know that statistically, probably not going to play pro ball, right? Probably not, no matter how much they want it. Would you be wisest to tell your kid, if you pray this way, God will answer your prayer and you will play pro ball? Or would it be more wise to say, man, pray to God about that. God may grant your desire. God may give you the skills and the talent and the opportunity to play pro ball, and we'll praise him if he does, but God may not. I think it's setting up an expectation. So is the expectation that we're abstinent for the sake of the reward of great sex and a good marriage? Or is the expectation of abstinence that we're following God's wisdom with our bodies because that's the wisdom that God tells us we should follow, and that he knows us best and he knows people because he created them and he knows what will bring us the most true joy, pleasure, belonging, happiness, right? I think it's the way that we set up. So yes, I think abstinence is a good expectation, just how we go about setting up the expectation and kind of what we promise as the outcome of that expectation.
And then also like explaining there's consequences to sin.
Absolutely,
Right? So,
yes.
like, you might not have a great sex life if you're abstinent, but if you do all this getting into sin and doing all this stuff, like
Yeah,
you definitely won't have
yes.
a good sex life. Like,
Yeah,
it's-
and there's also consequences to making something an idol. And you can say, hey, you can make abstinence an idol, right? You can make that the reward in your heart is greater. The reward of great sex, your imagined spouse, is greater to you than the reward of pleasing God. And that becomes an idol, and we need to talk about the negative consequences of that too. So absolutely, that's a really great point, that like we do need to remind our kids that when we don't follow God's wisdom, hey man, I didn't follow God's wisdom in these ways, and here's some negative consequences I experienced. I don't want you to have to experience those. Hey man, I set up this idol in my heart. I thought I was doing the right thing, staying pure, and I did do the right thing, staying pure, but I did it for some really selfish reasons. And man, that distorted my thinking about sex, and I really had to repent, and I really had to help ask God to reteach me about the way he sees sex. Just however kind of that worked out, we can really speak to in whatever way we experience negative consequences, and hopefully help our kids avoid some of those as well. That's a really good point. Okay, where was I? So yeah, to your point, when we're kind of pushing abstinence for the sake of great sex or using sex to sell abstinence, we're really, rather than teaching, valuing God's wisdom and teaching our kids to pursue God's wisdom, we're really teaching our kids to value virginity and pursue that, right? So again, it's a different like heart posture. And if our kids do remain virgins, it's not because they're recognizing that God's wisdom is best, it's because they're promised this highly sought after reward for their good behavior. So we just want to be careful of that. All right, and then third, God's wisdom leads kids toward the most joy, most meaning, richest belonging, truest pleasure in this lifetime. If our kids, and if we, believe that a God exists, and we believe that that God is the God of the Bible, and if we believe that that God of the Bible really truly knows what's best for us, if we really believe those things, we would be very foolish not to follow that wisdom. So if we, or if our kids are unwilling to follow God's wisdom, even when it's costly, it really begs the question, do you actually believe those things? Permit me a sports analogy here. If LeBron James was your basketball coach and you ignored his advice about how to become a better basketball player, we would say, you are a fool, right? So how much better is God's wisdom about the ways that he designed us to enjoy the most goodness and most beauty and most meaning in this life? And if God's wisdom really is best, our kids can be saved the unnecessary pain of figuring out the best paths through trial and error. Plus, God's wisdom will lead them to the deepest experiences of joy and meaning and purpose. So we can trust that God's wisdom really is best, and we can trust that God's wisdom really will lead our kids to the best things in life when they choose to follow it. All right, what is challenging about offering God's wisdom to kids, and particularly God's wisdom about sexual stewardship? And how does it contrast with the quote-unquote wisdom of sexual fulfillment that's offered to them by secular culture, by American cultural Christianity? And then how have you modeled for the kids in your life that following God's wisdom is best, even when it's inconvenient or lonely or hard? How are you modeling that for them? All right, let's take 5 minutes on this one. We're a tiny bit behind. Bless whoever sneezes. If there's any more hot water. It's gonna work. It still tastes
It's
fine.
the whole point of them is to like
Yeah.
using them, and that's why it's like the thing. But
I think the hot water is just
it refreshes it.
a lot of what helps too, being warm.
More of them if you feel like that one.
It's okay for now.
Or you can add one of the.
Yeah, one of these.
Sometimes I add another tea to my tea.
Make it, give it a little bit different flavor. We have green tea, lemongrass, spearmint, rose petals, and soothing herbs, and chamomile. That's probably not. Probably don't want that. Oh, this one's got caffeine in it.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't need to reheat it.
Yeah, I turned it back on. Black tea. I like the spout. Orange peel to water your yeah.
So nice. Like, why aren't these that were like pour overs a long time ago?
Oh yeah.
I would be like taking them on my
It's on the porch.
We've gone through multiple cans because they rust.
Does it click off? I don't know what it does. Let's see if that was warm. I think it is. Actually, ugh. All right, let's try that. Oh, cord's falling down. All right, so if you take what I have been teaching minus the discussion time, I've only been teaching for about an hour and a half. This is 6 hours worth of content, okay? So I can't hit everything in an hour and a half, so I want to encourage you guys to go. You have access to the on-demand parent course. It's 12 videos. I think it's the first 4, maybe 5 that cover what I've covered here. So if you're like, we did not talk about XYZ deep enough, yes, I know. I wish we could go deeper, but we didn't have a 10-hour day. We had a 5-hour day. So go to the parent course videos. I think, Kevin, if you have the login, if you don't, I'll get it to you. And you guys can watch through those. You can also email me if you have further questions. But we're going to move to a little bit different part. All right, we're going to talk about when. So we're getting into the more practical stuff now. What age, the brave among you, what age do you think you should start having questions with kids or conversations with kids about sex, sexuality, and gender?
4.
3, 4?
You said 2 to 12, so I'm gonna go 2.
Yeah, I kind of gave it away. A lot of people, that's right, at birth. No, a lot of people feel like, oh, like I have all this time. I've got until they're 10 or 11 or 12, right? Nah, I've got until they're 14 or 15. I've got all this time. High school, I'll start talking about these things in high school. I wish that were the case, but here's my answer. It's usually we need to start talking about sexual stewardship earlier than we think. Why early? Well, it's because of these statistics. Kids become aware of their own sex, their own gender around age 2, and then become aware of social differences between boys and girls by 2nd grade. Puberty begins somewhere between the age of 8 and 14. Kids first become aware of their own sexual attractions. Kind of sexuality begins to blossom around age 9 or 10. Again, remember the average age to exposure to porn is 11. And at this point in our culture, porn exposure is not an if, it's a when. Okay? And about 14% of teens have had sexual intercourse by age 15. I think my other statistic said 70% of kids have sex by the time they're 18. That's trending down. So this is actually a more current statistic. I need to change the other one. I looked this one up recently. It's trending down because kids are online more and they're not meeting in person more, so they're not having sex as much, which is good, but also they're not learning how to be in relationships, so that's not good. But it is trending down. Now it's just over half. All right, so if we look at those statistics, I think we can agree it's probably wise that we're sharing what we want the kids to know about God's wisdom for sexual stewardship and about God's love for LGBT plus people no later than the end of 4th grade. Okay, that's about age 9. All right, and then we're going to follow up with more complex conversations in 5th and 6th grades. Okay, and the goal here is to guide our kids' understanding before culture starts answering their questions for them. Again, we want to be the ones to set the tone for talking or learning about marriage and singleness and family and intimacy and sex and gender and sexuality. And so that means the sooner we begin to talk about these things, the better equipped our kids will be to make sense of the culture that they live in, as well as their own desires and feelings and attractions. And again, if you're not a parent, please, we want you to walk alongside us and talk about God's wisdom with our kids too. We need more voices in our kids' lives influencing our kids towards God's wisdom. We already have enough voices in our kids' lives influencing them away. Okay. I think we have to remember, just like we said earlier, the talk is not a one-time conversation you have with your 6th grader, if only, but it's not. So rather than dumping everything we know about sexual stewardship onto our kids at age 12, we want to have conversations that happen many times and in age-appropriate ways all throughout childhood. Let me give you an analogy here. If you were planting a garden, do you dump all the seeds in one place at one time? No, you're not going to have any vegetables to eat or flowers to cut if you do that. You need to plant the seeds at the right time, spaced apart, in soil that's been prepared, and then you need to tend to those seeds over time. You don't neglect them after they've been planted. You need to make sure they have adequate water and plenty of sun, maybe some fertilizer. Conversations about sexual stewardship with our kids are the same. All right. Let's just shout out some answers since we're behind on time. Where in kids' lives have you seen that these conversations are necessary to have before the teen years? Let's have 3 people answer. Give me some examples.
Our 7-year-old daughter just didn't quite understand how the sperm reaches the egg.
Yeah, that's a fun one.
Like, just curious about how I have, a baby in my belly and
Yeah.
what happens. And it's like, okay, well,
Yeah,
guess we're going there.
yeah. Okay, that's one. Need 2 more. Be brave. Come on, guys.
Whenever their body started to change,
Mm-hmm.
start happening.
Yeah, and that happens before the teen years, as early as age 8 for some kids. Yeah.
My 3-year-old nephew wondering why his body is different than mommy's body.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. There's a page I follow that has great and really funny things that kids say about parents' bodies. Yeah, they notice. Like, they notice things are different and they want to know why, and they ask a question. That's great. It's a good opportunity for conversation, but yes, that's before the teen years, right? Okay, so we know we need to talk about these things. Maybe we don't know how. What are some best practices when it comes to conversation with kids? Okay, I'm going to hurry through this so we can eat. All right. I don't think you're restricted to talking about sexuality stuff when your kids bring it up or when something happens. I think we can bring it up. And I think we need to carve out intentional time to speak to our kids about, in age-appropriate ways, about God's wisdom for all of these things well before sexual attractions begin to show up. And remember, that's at age 10. So we got a lot to talk about between ages 2 and 8, 2 and 9. I think that's a little daunting, but I think we can do it. So what are some best practices? One, use what you have. You don't got to go out and buy some expensive curriculum, right? Use what you already have access to. Bible stories. You can speak intentionally about single people in the Bible. Point that out. Hey, Paul was single. What does he have to say about singleness? Point out how churches in the New Testament were family to one another, and what did that mean in the cultural context of the New Testament. It was really important to be married and have children, but people felt like they were free to be single in the New Testament church. Why? Talk about that with your kids. Weddings. What's God's plan and purpose for Christian marriage? How is that different from legal marriage? How is that different from what culture says marriage is? Commercials, advertisements, so many opportunities there. Adoption. Wonderful opportunity to talk about how we're all adopted into God's family and what that now means as we live out our lives in submission to Jesus and putting His family first. Bath time. Great time for body parts conversations, right? Just about anything can be used to start a conversation about sexual stewardship. Next would be to get comfortable. With young kids, you want to find a comfortable spot to talk. Use picture books, read a story, draw together. When they're in elementary school, the car is a great place for conversations. They are buckled in. They can't go anywhere, right? Make sure it's not a 3-hour road trip maybe. But if you're on that 20-minute drive to soccer practice, you can bring something up, and it's a great place for conversation because for a couple reasons. One, you can't look them in the eyes, and that can make things feel intimidating for both you and your kid. You can't look at them. They're more willing to talk maybe if you can't stare at them. Two, they know that the conversation has an end. When they get to soccer practice, they are done with that conversation. So it makes you or them feel weird. You both know you got an end time, right? In 20 minutes, we're going to be at the field, and they have to get out and be done. And it's also usually fewer distractions. You can turn off the music. Little brother's not running around the background. There's not TV blaring. It can be a good place for conversation in the car. You want to stay away from distractions in loud places. Don't have the TV on. Don't go to a noisy restaurant and try to talk about these things. And avoid places the kid may be overheard. If you have a kid that's easily embarrassed or shy, don't have the conversation with grandma in the same room. Don't have the conversation with your 3-year-old in the same room unless you want your 3-year-old asking you questions, right? If there's someone around that they just may feel like embarrassed around, don't have the conversation there. So just be aware of your surroundings. Check your tone. We don't want to convey like high stakes conversation, right? Because it's not. We're going to have lots of these conversations. So we want to be calm, cool, and collected. If you're anxious and afraid, your child's going to pick up on that, and then they're going to feel anxious and afraid. They're going to feel like they're in trouble. They're going to feel like they did something wrong. You're about to talk about something bad. Keep the pressure off. Let these topics be normal topics of conversation in your home. And you need to get comfortable with words. Guys, sex, penis, masturbation, pornography, vulva. Say them in the mirror if you need to, right? And if you giggle, maybe you should practice with someone else before you say them to your child. But you need to be able to use the right words from the time your kid is a tiny, tiny baby. There are lots of reasons for that. One is it helps protect your kids from sexual predation. Please always use the right body part words. And also, again, it's using the right words for things is not destroying innocence, it's destroying ignorance, okay? And that's the goal here. I think we need to treat conversations about sexual stewardship like we treat conversations about screen time or what we're having for lunch or here's how to tie your shoes. They're just normal, everyday conversations. And to that point, we want to have multiple small conversations. These are little bite-sized pieces, right? We're not giving them everything, like the garden analogy, all at once. That's going to help keep the pressure off of you, but it's also going to send the message that these topics are important enough to keep bringing up. And these topics, mom's not embarrassed. I can come in and talk to mom and dad about these things. I can come and talk to my uncle and my aunt about these things. I'll give you an example from my own life. When my daughter was 6 or 7, she heard, I think maybe 5, she heard somebody, my friend, say the word gay. That is not an unusual word in my home. But she hadn't apparently put two and two together. And she said, Mom, what's gay mean? And now I was in the middle of a conversation with my friend, and so I was caught off guard. I was not expecting her to run by, hear the word gay, and then ask me about it. And I was like, oh, what's gay mean? And she goes, yeah. And I said, it means a boy who likes boys or girls, or a girl who likes girls. Oh. And then she ran off to play. And that was it. That was the whole conversation. Now, is there more that I would like her to know about gay people and the word gay? Yes. But I did not feel the need to go run after her and say, I need you to know all these theological points about gay people, right? Because I know that we're going to have more conversations about gay people, the word gay, gay marriage, whatever, over the course of her childhood, right? So it was just a tiny bite-sized conversation. You can do that too, whether kids ask or whether you just bring it up. Please always give factual answers. Just make sure they're age appropriate, okay? Don't lie and don't brush off the question. If the kid is old enough to ask, they're old enough for an answer. Now again, you're going to make it age appropriate. But if you choose to lie, storks bring babies. It's a silly example. Probably none of you would say that. But let's say you told your kid that storks bring babies. Your kid's going to find that out. Next time they have a question, they're going to come to you and ask you, no, why? Because Dad lied last time. Maybe he won't tell me the truth this time, right? So please give an answer. Please give an honest answer. Just make sure it's an age-appropriate answer. If you're unsure what your child is asking, ask your child to repeat their question and clarify. Oh, can you tell me what you already know about that? What have you heard about that? Oh, tell me what you're wondering about. Tell me more. And that can help you figure out what they already know and where to fill in the gaps. And it can also help you figure out that the question, where did I come from, may not be them asking for a sex lesson. It may be them asking, we moved here from Tennessee, right? Right? So you want to make sure you're answering the right question, okay? So get some clarity. Use the right words for body parts. We already said that. Give the information that is needed. That may not be all the information. With my friend's kid who asked about gay sex, he's not going to get all the information about gay sex at 9, right? He's going to get what he needs, and that's it, right? So, and he's going to get that information in an age-appropriate way. Here's an example. If your 5-year-old says, what's birth? You can answer, well, that's when a baby comes out of its mother's body. But if your 10-year-old asks the same question, you're going to have a different answer. You're going to say something like, well, after 9 months of growing inside the mother's uterus, the baby comes out of the mother's birth canal or mother's vagina and enters the world, right? Different answers, age appropriate. If, let's say you're learning the 10 Commandments together, and your 6-year-old says, what's adultery? And that did happen to me. You can talk about how God is faithful and how God expects us to keep our promises and to treat others with honor and respect. But if your 12-year-old asks the same question, you're going to have a different answer. You're going to talk about abstaining from sexual sin. You're going to talk about Matthew 5, where Jesus notes that adultery isn't always a physical act, right? You're going to give more information and more context, all right? So always give an answer, give a factual answer, but just give an age-appropriate answer. You want to keep communication open. Did that answer your question? What do you think about that? What other questions do you have? What's going on in your life? What's going on at school that made you think about that question? Right? Just continue asking questions. They're going to get sick of it. They're going to run away at some point. But let them know that you are interested in the conversation. You're not the one that's going to cut the conversation off or cut it short or tell them they're too young to hear about that right now. You're going to be curious about why they're curious and hopefully continue to talk to them about those things.